Hello everybody, this is Jimmy Beach with Exposure Software. I am unmuted, yes. I'm just double checking to make sure that you can hear me. Welcome to our Exposure Beginners Guide webinar. In the next few minutes today, we'll go through the basics of using Exposure, and we'll touch on all of the major points in your post-processing workflow with Exposure. Exposure is our advanced, non-destructive raw photo organizer and editor. It handles your full post-processing workflow. You can use it to copy images from camera cards, organize, apply editing adjustments, creative effects, export your finished photos, and even print directly from within Exposure. A quick history lesson to let anybody else sign in today is that about 15 years ago, Exposure was developed for film photographers. The transition from developing analog film in the darkroom to processing images or capturing and processing images in a digital environment was radically new. And so Exposure and the accurate film emulation library of presets that Exposure developed essentially gave those film photographers their much loved films back, and they, then again were happy. And now Exposure, several years later, is, a full post-processing center, and we'll show you today. And so, as we get into the demonstration, I want to point out that we are monitoring the chat, and we will also save some time at the end if we need to address any technical questions or anything like that. So anyway, feel free to pipe up. So we're going to talk first about how Exposure makes photo organizing hassle-free, and then we're going to get into how to do editing and things like that. So at first, this is where we begin in Exposure. I'm going to open up the tab or the docs here so everybody can see. So we have our presets panel there. Here's our folders panel here. So when we first start Exposure, right, when we first begin processing images in Exposure, usually we begin with getting them from our camera card, okay? We call this ingesting sometimes. Okay, so when we put a camera card into the computer and we have Exposure open, it will pop up this window, the copy from card window. And now it's a pretty simple and straightforward workflow from here. Exposure handles lots of different raw files. So in addition to TIFF files, JPEG files, DNG files, and even Photoshop PSD files. So notice the numbered sections here across the top of this copy from card dialog that we're looking at. And we can see that there are numbered sections. So select source is the first section. This is where we choose where we're going to get our images from. We're going to choose our camera card. Then, in the second section is where we review our images. As you can see, it's pulling in thumbnails from the camera card now. And we can check or uncheck any of these if we want to, or go to maybe other folders, or we can select several camera cards or whatever, however we have our processing workflow. We also, here on the right, we select the destination and we tell it where we want the photos to go and what we want to do to them. So we can... Right now, I have my destination set up. It's going to save to the desktop. And we're going to generate a subfolder called John Barclay, because he's the guy that took all these fancy pictures that we're looking at today. Anyway, we can also add a subfolder within this folder if we wanted to and organize these photos, let's say, by the date that they were shot. And we can do that right here. It's really easy to do. We can also, if we have raw files and we want to convert to DNG because it's more a widely used file type, we can do that right here. We can choose to rename these photos, let's say, if we wanted to use like our client name here. And so it will change the names of the images as they're copied from the camera card. It's pretty simple to do. We can also add metadata to help with organizing, such as our copyright or website, anything like that you want to put in here. You can add keywords. You can add images into collections. And you can even add some of Exposure's presets onto the images as they're being copied. So anyway, we're not going to do any of that. I just wanted to show you that it's possible. And we'll say OK. So now I have all these images in here selected. It's telling me 31 source files. 31 will be copied. So we're going to copy them to our desktop into the John Barclay folder. Bam. So that is copying right now, and we can go right to the John Barclay folder and see. Every time that I do this, it so quickly processes these. Anyway, so I was going to show you that you could get into this. We're right now on our, if we look at our folders panel, we can see that we have our John Barclay folder right here, and all the images have been copied over already. So I was going to show you that even while it's being copied, we can move around to the different images and we can make edits to these photos if we want to while they're being copied. So if you imagine that you went on a shoot or on a vacation or visited a friend's house, I don't know, shot a wedding, you might have thousands of images that you're downloading at the same time, and you have lots of time to wait. You don't actually have time to wait. While it's processing, you can begin working on it. So that's one of the big perks to Exposure's workflow. And that's that it doesn't have a catalog. And there's also no modules. So there's no modules, and that means that at any time as we're working inside of Exposure, all of the commands are available all the time, right? So we're looking at thumbnails here. I can make edits to my image right here when it's in a thumbnail, or I can zoom in so it's full screen. I can make edits there. I can do it whenever, and I don't have any kind of mode that I have to change. There's also no catalog. So that is one of the great, awesome things about Exposure. I'm going to explain why. Exposure doesn't have a catalog, so as we can see here in our folders panel, we're looking at our desktop. You can see the folder right there. And then there's John Barclay and Melissa Ann Bagley. So here is a Finder window where I have my desktop. And you can see that I have John Barclay and Melissa Ann Bagley right here. Inside of this folder, here's where the no catalog part comes in. Exposure saves sidecar files for each of the images in the folder of images. Right here you can see all those sidecar files. So here, let's go to the John Barclay folder. Here we go, John Barclay folder. Now, we can see inside the John Barclay folder, we have an Exposure software folder, and that's where these sidecar files for these images that we're looking right here in the back, that's where this stuff lives. Okay, so because there's no catalog, if we want to back this up, we can just drag this whole folder down to our backup drive, and all of our edits and information and organizing and all that stuff goes along with that, so we don't have to worry about it. All right, it makes backups really easy. Also, we'll get into how you can share that information with people too later in the demonstration. Okay, now we'll talk about organizing real quick, and it does go real quick. The idea in the workflow in using Exposure is that you can get through organizing your images really quick so that you can get to the fun part of editing them. I'm going to close that tab for a little bit, or that dock. So we're looking here at some thumbnails. Okay, so Exposure has a bunch of different tools that you can use to organize your photos. I just talked about how we're looking right here in our folders panel, and in our folders panel, this is exactly the same thing as on our hard drive. So I'm going to close the folders panel so that we don't keep staring at it. Actually, I lied. I'm going to leave it open. We also have collections down here at the bottom, and collections are a way of grouping images together. You can see there's a bunch of them. Grouping images together that may exist in different places on your computer or on your hard drive, and you can group them together here, and it is essentially a digital photo album. So you can have however many pictures you want, you can put 1 million pictures in each one of these if you want to, and you can make as many of these as you want. You're not going to fill up your hard drive with duplicate files. It's just a good way to organize. Okay, let's talk about culling our images or editing the shoot down to the top selects. Okay, so Exposure, you can use flags. Flags are, I'll highlight them as I say them. Flags right here on the left. You left click, you can flag the image. See that it's picked there. Left click again, it goes to a reject flag, and that's no flag. I just went back to nothing. You can also right click on there and choose what flag to set. You also have color labels right here on the right side in the grid, or in the grid view. Right click. You can look at all of the different color options that you have here. to set the image. You can left click to set or to cycle through the colors. Right. Also, we have the star ratings that you can select here in the middle, or set here in the middle, excuse me. And you can just click on those to set one. There's 5. Pretty easy. Right? Same thing there. Oh, right click doesn't work on this one, by the way. Okay, so we can also use the keyboard, which makes things even quicker. So the numbers 1 through 5 on the keyboard set the corresponding star. And we can then use the keyboard, the arrow keys on the keyboard to navigate through the images in the folder. Okay, so we're organizing our images right now, all right? And we're going to use these things that I just covered to organize these images quickly. So I'm just going to run through these really fast and look at them and say whether I think they're great shots or whether I think they're okay shots or how I can use them for what. And you can just run through really quick and use the arrow key buttons down here to navigate through. And you assign something with a number. You can also use the numbers 6 through 9 on the keyboard to assign a color label, or you can use the plus or minus button to flag and reject. Now, it went pretty quickly as we went through these images, but I want to point out that you can go even quicker if you use keyboard shortcuts, such as the Shift key. So if I hold down Shift, and let's say I'm going to run through these images and give them all star ratings. So I'm going to use the numbers 1 through 5. I'm holding down Shift on the keyboard, and I don't need to use the arrow keys. So I'm just going to give this one an assigned number 4, and you can see that it's automatically going to the next image in the batch. See how it does that? So I only have one button to push on the keyboard, and it does those 2 functions for me. So that goes super fast. You can do the same thing when you're applying color labels or pick or reject flags too. Just like that. Okay? So now that we have all of our ratings and things, we can call this shoot down very quickly to show us just the best images that have at least 4 stars or that are, have a yellow color label, right? So I set up my filter on the bottom here to sort through my images that are in that folder quickly. Okay, so I'm going to turn that filter off. So now we were talking about calling our shoot, and now we have called this, let's say, shoot down so that we can pick through and find which images we want to find or locate quickly, just like that. Okay? Now we're going to get into the fun stuff, and that is the processing or the editing of our images. So I'm going to go to the other folder here on my desktop. That's Melissa Ann Bagley. These are her images. Okay, and actually let's talk about, we went through the filtering of our images really quick, so let's point something out here, and that's that you can use a whole bunch of different options down here for how the images are presented to you in the grid. And one thing that I'm going to do is use metadata. Now, you can see inside of this folder all of the file names here. You can see this one's a JPEG image. This one's a CR2. This one's a PSD. Right? So there's a bunch of different things in here. And what I'm going to use is metadata right here. I'm just going to type in CR2. And now I'm only looking at raw images in that folder. So it was a really practical and easy to use way of filtering out images. So use filters whenever you can. They're really helpful when organizing images. So now let's get into processing. Okay, so we editing adjustments can do 2 different things. Okay, we want to think about it as you can do editing adjustments to correct issues in a photo, like fixing softness, or if there was a white balance issue or something like that, right? Correcting issues. And then there's another type of processing that you do, and that is editing the photo or creatively making corrections to the image, right? So the first time when you come into exposure and you're going to start editing your images, the first thing that you want to do is correct the issues in those images. All right, so I'm going to grab all those images with Command A, and then I'm going to reset because I want to start over from the beginning. These are completely raw, straight out of the camera images. Okay, I'm going to close this. Now, so when you're working on images in exposure, you can just double click on them to open them up at full screen view, just like this. we'll talk about correcting our, speaking of correction, hey look, lens correction. This is a good place to start. Lens correction and exposure can be done automatically, or you can do it manually if you choose to. For supported lenses, there's a profile that's here. You can also use manual tools here if you want to apply lens distortion corrections or vignette or chromatic aberration correction. I'm going to use the profile. Also, we can make adjustments to like sharpening. There's the transform tools. That's another place, a good place to start when you're making adjustments to the image. If there's some skew or kerning or perspective distortion going on inside the image, that would be a good place to start making correcting issues in the image. Like, well, we don't really have any issues because it's a flower, but you know, excuse me. Also, we want to do any sharpening or noise reduction. Those are kind of, these are correcting issues type edits that you'd make too. So sharpening and exposure is really easy to use, and a good keyboard shortcut to remember when you're using sharpening is the Alt key. So inside of exposure, if you hold the Alt key, I'm going to turn that way up so we can really see. If we hold down the Alt key and drag our radius, this tells us what edges are being selected by the width of the radius in the image. So if you can see, I can turn it way up and I'll see that. And then if I hold down the Alt key and I adjust the masking, this tells us how much, or this shows us in the image, which edges are being selected by or for the sharpening effect. So the less that you show here, right, just the little tiny bits of those edges, those are just the edges that are going to have the sharpening effects applied. So I'm going to turn the amount down, obviously, because it was way too strong. And then we can turn that off and back on. It's just a little tiny, subtle bit of sharpening there. It looks great. Okay. Noise reduction, same kind of thing. There's also, actually, the noise reduction and exposure X6 is new and uses our profile. It's based off of the camera profile, camera sensor size, and it takes a bunch of things into consideration. You can also make adjustments by removing more types of noise, such as luminance. If you see that there's a bunch of color noise in the back, or I mean light and dark spot noise, or if you see color noise in the back, right, you can turn that off there. Okay, also crop and straighten. That's another one of those really important things, crop and straighten. So I will go to the crop tool, and it's pretty simple and easy to use, just like this. You can also choose from some preset crop ratios, such as 1:1. If we just want to do something square like that, that's pretty cool. You can also use the level or that rotation slider here, so we can put this at an angle if we need to, or we can set a straight line. This is the horizontal line, or the horizontal or vertical line tool. If you select it and then draw a line in your image, whoops, come on, let me reset. We select it and draw a line. There we go. Then it sets the crop rotation for you. All right, cool. Turn that off. Okay, great. Now as I run my hands together with a menacing face, we're going to talk about the presets, because that's where it all began. So let's go over to the left side. Presets panel's right here. I'm going to drag the splitter up here. We don't need the folders anymore because we're working in this one folder. We'll open up the presets panel, and we can see there's all of our presets listed down here. All the presets are organized into folders, so they're really easy to find. They're organized by type. So if we go to color films, for example, or color looks, and let's see, these are color film presets. So inside of our slide film presets, well, I have it in list mode, so let me change that here. Right here on the top, I can preview this with like 3Y there. So now we can see all these little thumbnails on the left side, and that's going to show us what the preset's going to look like on our image. If we could just hover over these, each one to see it, and the preview here in the middle, the large image in the middle is the preview image. And that is going to show us what it will look like. So we click to apply the preset to our image, just like that. You can see. Over here in our layers panel, it says Fuji Velvia 100. That is the preset that I selected. So again, there's a ton of presets in exposure, not just color ones, black and white ones too. Some black and white ones in here. Again, the presets in exposure are great starting points to get you going when you're making edits in exposure, or you can use multiple presets and blend and make your own creative look. For example, I can put, I'll put this one, Agviscala. I'll just drag it over and let go on add layer, and they'll see and put it in a new layer. So why would I want to do that? Well, I can blend the effects of this layer. Oh yes. This is a black and white image, and that's why it gave me that prompt. But I can blend the effects of that. Let me choose another one. That's going to be confusing. Delete layer. Let's do another color one. Here we go. So I'll add another layer, and then we can make adjustments to that if we want to blend it with our Fuji Velvia preset. And then we'll hold down the backslash, oops, let me get off the mask there. Backslash key, we can see a before and let go. That's our after, right? So we now have 2 layers to make our own cool, crazy, creative preset. 3 C words in a row. Did you hear that? I didn't even practice that. Okay, now that's our presets, okay? So we're going to talk about layers shortly. That's why I undid what I did there with those presets. But I was just showing that you can mix them together really easily to create your own custom looks inside of exposure, okay? Now, let's talk about editing. I'm going to, yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about editing. Okay, so I hit escape to go back to the grid view, and then we can see we have 4 images in our folder, okay? So since we're talking about editing, we want to make things quick, right? So to get you through or to get you moving on a way of making some edits to an image, a quick way to get going is to use the automatic adjustments. So I'm just going to hit Command A and hit Auto. And Exposure is going to intelligently analyze the image and then apply some edits to get me going in my editing journey, right? So I'm going to hit Command D, and that deselects that whole batch of images that I just had selected there. Now I want to point out that the auto adjustments that we applied don't apply the same effect to each image. So on this one, this pink camellia I think, it has a positive exposure value of 1 stop, a little bit over. This one only has 0.84 in the exposure value. You can see it right here. Next one, this one's much different. Okay, so what I mean is when I say intelligent adjustments, that's exactly what I'm saying. Exposure studies these images before it applies the effects that you choose when you choose your automatic adjustments here inside of here. Okay. Now, one thing that we did do is we just applied automatic adjustments to all of these images. So I'm going to be really organized and rename this layer basic edits just to be, extra careful, right? So we have our basic edits that we just applied, right? So when you're making adjustments in exposure, oops. There. So when you're making adjustments in exposure, the basic panel is usually where you start. That's why I hit auto just like that, okay? So you'll find inside the basic panels where you make adjustments like color or black and white mode. That's very important. Or if you have a camera profile that you use, you could load it here. You set the white balance information, and then all of your different tone adjustments that you can make here, including clarity and saturation in this panel. When you're making adjustments in exposure, start at the top of the panel. Those are usually the most important adjustments, and then work your way down through them. Oftentimes, the adjustments you make up at the top of the panel are stronger or more fundamental, and then the ones as you work your way down through the panel are more for refinement of the adjustments that you made on that panel. Okay? So, that's in our basic panel. Let's, I want to look at an image here. This one's pretty. Okay, so then we'll look at another one after the basic panel, then we'll talk about the color panel, right? So the color panel is a great way that you can make color toning effects to an image, such as adding just a touch of warm tone or cool tone to an image, just to give it a little bit of punch. That's something that's really easy to do right here in exposure. We also have more sophisticated ways that you can select and control colors in your image. Down here in the detailed adjustments section, so we have full hue, saturation, and luminance controls for all of the image tones for all the tones in the image, for all the colors, in the image. We can grab individual sliders just like this to, let's see, I want to grab the red one to make adjustments. As you can see how the image, like the pink inside the flower here, if I grab the reds slider, I can make it more pink to add a maroon or magenta, tone. Same thing with all of these different sliders. This is just to make small hue adjustments. So I want to make the yellow tone, I want to make more red. I think that'll punch up the middle. And then I'll make the red a little more magenta. Okay. So that's an easy and quick way to make some adjustments. You can see those effects happening. So saturation is another way that we can control tones in the image. And a good example of that would be like, let's say that we want to reduce the appearance of the saturation in a place that's, let's say, like the highlights. If we want to reduce the saturation in the highlights to give it a little bit more of a wispy feel or an old-fashioned feel, we can do that. Or we can reduce the appearance of the saturation in just the shadow areas. You can see that. Now, if you do this, if I crank it all the way down, you can see that the effect's very strong. But if I do it very subtly, then we can use that, for example, as a sort of vignette where since the shadows in this image appear all around the outside of the image, then it actually has a little bit of a drawing effect to make you look at the flower in the center. So that's another good option that we have here for making some adjustments. Also, we can, let's use the luminance sliders for this. We can make adjustments to individual colors to make them brighter or darker. So I'm going to use the color picker, which is this icon right over here, and go in and grab this yellow here in the center, and I want to make that yellow brighter, right? And you can see that it's adjusting all of the yellow tones in the image, which includes the background tones, which I didn't really care for. I liked it when the background was a little darker, so I might have some tweaking to do. Anyway, so I'll just make some adjustments there. We can see we have some color, and now I will close the color panel. Now, let's talk about the tone curve panel, because we're kind of on that same controlling the tone values in your image theme, and this is a way to do it. So if you use the color or the curve editor in Exposure or in a Photoshop or Lightroom or wherever, you'll feel right at home because this is the curve editor. Anytime that you see one of these long drop-down lists in Exposure, that's usually a preset list. So you can go through and assign this some preset curves, like Milky Blacks is one. Just use that one. Okay, and you can see that this preset curve has a couple of nodes, and we can just grab a hold of those and move them inside of the curve editor, or drag it off outside of the curve editor and let go to remove it. Pretty easy to do. You can also use the sliders down below, and then you can see what that does to the curve in the curve editor with a dotted line. Down below we have split toning, which adds a separate toning effect to the brighter or darker tones values in the image. It's really popular in black and white film photography. Well, photography, black and white photography. But there are some color options too. They can do some really neat looking things to your images. So it's really simple. It's that this color handle on the left has a blue tone, and you can see it right here. We can move this slider to adjust that tone if we want, and we dial in the strength however strong we want it to be. So any of these things inside of Exposure are completely customizable. You can make them however you want. Also, there's this icon on the right side, right next to the preset, and that is where you can save your own presets. So anywhere in Exposure, you can see right here, you can save a preset for a custom split toning look, or you can save a preset for your own tone curve that you make. So look for those when you're using exposure. It's a way that you can make your editing much, much quicker. Okay, so you know what we didn't talk about was the spot heal tool. So I'm going to get into that right now. So inside of exposure, we have the spot heal tool. We also have clone mode. So there's a spot heal tool, or there's the heal mode and clone mode. You can see them right here. And the brush tool, if I open this, you have heal and clone. Now, I've had a lot of people say, I want you to see how you use this. So I'm going to show you how I use it right now. So I'm going to hit Command plus and zoom in. And I'm going to use the space bar to turn my cursor into the pan handle. You can see it. There's a spot. Okay, so the heal tool is a good option when we have a soft surface like this that doesn't have a lot of texture and we want to remove an area, right? Okay, so after we make our spot, we can make adjustments to the active spot with the sliders on the top. So let me turn these outlines always. Okay, so now hopefully you can see the marching ants around the spot that I just put down. So I want the opacity all the way up, and I'm going to, I don't know, I'll leave the feather where it is. I'm going to make it a little bit larger to make sure that I'm covering that spot completely. And let's move over to another spot. Speaking of spots, let's find another one. There's some darker ones. Now there's a very small little thing right here, but I don't think I'd take that out. Ooh, this yellow spot in here is kind of, I don't know, disturbing, let's say. So, again, this is a soft area, or it's not, it doesn't have a lot of texture or anything like that where I'd have to duplicate texture. So I'm going to use the heal mode again. Now, when I have a larger area like that, I usually use small zones, let's say, smaller spots, because it just has a better way of blending for me. That's just from my experience. So, and you can just go right over the same spot again and again. Let me go auto, there. You can go over the same spot again and again if you have some residual effects, just like that, okay? So that is the heal brush, okay? But now let's talk about the clone brush. And I actually saw a thing down here that I want to fix. Oh, it's terrible. See that right there? Oh no. This is a good one for the clone brush. So what we're going to do is fix this little tear in the edge of our petal. Okay? So I switched over to clone brush. I put a spot down. And now I'm going to make some adjustments. So I'm actually going to turn the opacity of it down so that as I make little tweaks to it, I can line it up better. Okay. So what I'm going to do is grab a hold of this other area that I just copied in and make a little bit of tweaks here and there. You can see how I'm getting it lined up. And do. Pretty close. Now, let me zoom in one more time. Command plus. Man, it's really close. Okay, so we see we have a little bit of a hanger right there where it's like fuzzy. So I will use a smaller clone brush and then go outside of that area and then just go right back in there for a second time. Bam! Now we have it fixed. Okay. So now, that was a great demo, actually. I'm going to pat myself on the back later. That looks good. Little tears inside those petals make the flower look so much older than it is, you know? Anyway, okay, so that was the spot and clone tool. Yeah, spot heal and clone tool. We did both of those. That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about some more edits real quick here. We can talk about the Vignette tool. Vignette is a great way of drawing attention to the subject. You can add a darkening effect or a lightening effect in your vignette, depending on what you're going for. After we add a vignette, let's just grab one of the presets here. You have a bunch of options inside of exposure to make that vignette appear very organic in shape. So, for example, I will take the softness out, and we can see how that oblong edge is there. I want to make it a little smaller, and then we can control how that distortion affects the shape of that vignette, and we can change the size of the little fractal lumps that distort that vignette. So there we go, and then we'll soften that back up and make it much bigger. So there we go. Usually I crank a vignette up like this, and then I do my work on it, and then I turn it back down so that it's not as strong. So we can turn the effect off and on with the blue toggle on the panel right here. All right. Also, let's talk about bokeh. Bokeh. I used to say bokeh, but I've been corrected by plenty of Japanese people. Bokeh is a Japanese word. It talks about the out of focus areas of an image, the quality of those out of focus areas, in fact. Bokeh applies blurring effects to the image, and applies blurring effects, but it gives you some tools that you can control that blurring effect with realistic fall off or controllable fall off. Here's what I mean. So if we crank the amount up, we can see that we have blurring applied to this image, and inside of we have this region that we can move and manipulate around the image to apply our effects. Now, this dotted line is where the fall off or where the effect is 100%, and then this edge here, the solid line edge, is where the effects or the blurring effect is at 0%. So I can turn the amount of the blurring that I'm going to apply down so it's real subtle, and then I can make it so that it only applies after we get outside of this edge. If you can see that. So then these petals in the background on the left have a little bit more, it adds a little bit more distance and pushes those back, makes it look like more of a closer macro shot. Anyway, really, really powerful stuff in here. Tons of presets too. Let me see. We haven't talked about grain. So let's talk about grain real quick. Grain and exposure, you're not going to find a place that is better than the grain and exposure. It's the very best out there. Just throwing you some insider knowledge. Lots of presets. There's also presets inside of exposure, inside of the exposure presets that you might apply. So we can just select from the grain presets here. You can control where the grain appears in the image. More in the shadows. You can see if I put it all 100% in the shadows, we can see where it's starting to show right here. Or if I don't want to show any in the shadows because it, I don't know, has a nice gentle fade and I want it to show it in the highlights, I can do it like that. So you have a lot of adjustability here to make this effect, or to make the effects of the grain appear where you want them to, if you want to give your photo an analog film look. Tons and tons of options to control here. It's really, really great. Okay, let's talk about overlays. We're almost there. Also, I want to point out after I do this. Okay, so in exposure, you can apply borders, light leaks, and texture over your image simultaneously. You can select from different textures to add. So a border would be something that you could add that would be like a vintage effect. Like here you go. This one looks like an old viewfinder plate or plate glass, something like that. We have some film ones. This is like 55 millimeter. That's 35 millimeter. Here's 55 millimeter. This is a, what is that? Peel stick, or the, large format Polaroid film. Anyway, there's a bunch of different ones that you can choose from, or just really simple ones like white. Good old fashioned white border. Okay. Also, we can add light effects. We can manipulate these however we want. If you want to zoom that or make that border a little bit smaller, you can. If you want to take the opacity down, you can. If you want to make it a black border, you can. I just flip that over just like that. We can also add light effects. Light effects are a great way to spice up an image, maybe if it needs it, or if you have an existing effect going on and you want to emphasize that, you can. There's a ton of different options here. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of options. So it's really up to you wherever you, no, that's not going to work with this image. It's really up to you how you want to experiment with this type of thing. But you can move these light effects around in your image, rotate them. You can make them, I don't know, well, very subtle, let's say, right? Larger, smaller, subtle. You can also change the blend mode on them so that they affect the image differently in the way that tweaks to the tonal ranges and things, just like this. Yeah, that's weird. That looks like a science experiment gone wrong, but it does have a very filmic-like quality to it. Not gonna do it. Anyway, actually, I'll leave it on. Just turn it way down. There we go. Okay, cool. So we haven't talked about layers, okay? And so now I want to get into talking about layers. I can't handle it. I gotta turn the light effect off. Okay, so we have one layer on this image, and this is, for those of you who've been waiting to pay attention to how I'm going to do things with the brush and the gradient, just pay attention now. This is for you, okay? So now we're going to get into layers. I've made some basic edits on this image, and we can see them by hovering our cursor over the layer thumbnail. Obviously, I've made quite a few edits to this image. As you can see, they're all listed here. Now, if we hover our cursor over the layer thumbnail, it shows us the extents of that layer thumbnail. What is being selected will be highlighted in red. Okay? Now, I want to open the layers panel. Now, what I'm going to do, I want to add a little bit of brightening inside of this flower, right in the center, okay? So I will click Add Layer, and I know that I want, so I'm going to do a dodge effect here. That's brightening. So I will select the layer mask. Doing that opens up the mask, the brush panel, right? And this brush panel is where we make adjustments to our mask, okay? So the simplest way to do this is to use the brush, all right? So I will just make the brush size larger, and I'd usually use a flow on my brush. I don't usually set it really strong, so I'm going to leave that in the middle. That gives me a little bit more control so that I can go over an area several times, right? Okay, so I'm brushing right now, and exposure gives me a prompt that says you are using an empty brush, and they are right. So let's not use an empty brush anymore. We'll choose the preset from the right here, what we want this layer to do, and I want it to lighten. So I just selected it there. Okay, so now we have this way overdone brightening in the center of our flower. All right. So that's you guys, I know you're complimenting my mask skills because wow, look at that. That was terrible. So the brush, in this case, the brush is a really simple and straightforward way of selecting inside of this flower, okay? So let me turn the opacity of that layer down so that it's more dialed into the image the way I would like it to be. Let's turn this off. All right, that's within the scope of being realistic, okay? 47%. Let's, I'm going to turn on show mask and let's make some adjustments to our mask boundaries. Okay, so what we can do is I can go here, I can choose the eraser brush, and I can clean up this mask boundary just like this. And it will show you, you know, my flow is on very low, so I really got to work this to make it go away. Okay, so when you have a really low flow value like I do there, as long as I don't totally cover the area that I'm trying to mask, then it does a pretty good job of cleaning up that edge and giving me a nice soft edge, right? Because I want it to have that nice soft subtle edge like it actually happened, okay? So I'm going to turn show mask off. So let's take a peek at what we did. And on. Okay, that's way better. That fits a lot better. Okay, so that was with the brush, all right? Now, the brush has its ups and downs. If you have a more complicated thing that you want to brush, then it can be more cumbersome. So let's use this image. So we did some dodge effect there, but it didn't really do exactly what we needed it to do in here. We need some clarity and we need some detail. So what we can do is, since we've separated our edits on separate layers, we can add to our dodge layer. We can also add sharpening, right? Or, let's add some sharpening. Okay. Well, when we talked about sharpening, this sharpening amount, if I turn this up, it goes to 150. And if I turn the radius up, which enables us to put a stronger sharpening effect on the image, it goes to 5. Okay, I'm going to turn that off. You can barely see that affecting the image right there in the middle. And turn it back on. Okay. So instead of using sharpening, I'm going to go down to the focus panel, which has a sharpen section. Now, the focus panel is, the effects here are much stronger, right? So if we wanted to add sharpening, we can add sharpening with a preset, or we can use, well, there's bunches of them here, but you can see, if I'm hovering over these presets, you can see that this is a much stronger effect. So I'm going to just choose one of those presets so we can see. So the amount goes up to 100, not 150, but the radius goes up to 100 instead of 5, right? So that's not very much sharpening effect. This is a lot of sharpening. We can see how it brings that grain out here inside of that flower. Okay. So that's a good thing to remember, is that you have two different sets of sharpening tools. You have the sharpening panel, which is to, like I said before, correct issues inside the photo. And then you have the focus effects, which are for doing more creative type looks. Okay. So now I'm going to add another layer. And in this layer, I want to do some, let's say, darkening. I'm going to choose darkening because I think it's going to be easier for everybody to see the demo. Okay? Just going out on a limb here. So I have my brush open. This time I'm going to use one of the gradients. Okay? So I selected the, what is this? Planar gradient, full planar gradient. It has, so essentially what this is doing is you can see the layer mask over here on the right. Here, I'll show mask. What this is doing is it's giving me a bar or a strip in the middle of the image that is completely 100% dark, and then it fades out on the top and bottom in an equal way. Okay? So I can make adjustments to that however I need, just like this. Oops. Okay? And move that however we want to. So here's what I'm going to do with this. I said I put it to darken. I'm going to move this to the edge here, and we're going to build in a nice edge because I want to add some, I want to make this background darker so that it goes back, pushing it back with this mask, okay? So now I have my gradient selected, right? But I don't want it to touch the flower. I just want it to hit the background, okay? So I have my gradient because it gives me this nice feathered edge right here as it applies this effect, right? But I'm also going to use the color constraints. So for this image, I'm using pink flower, right? So it's a pink flower and there's not really pink in the background. So hue is probably going to be the easiest way for me to make my selection. Okay. So I don't want the pink flower. What I do want is the background. So I'll just select that background tone right there. And it did a pretty good job of getting that edge cleaned up for me. But we can see that there's a little bit of residual here on the flower petal in the front or in the foreground. Now let's actually change the mask view to this one, saturation. This thing is going to be easier for us to see it. So hopefully you guys can see there. Nice and bright. We can see where the edges of the mask are, and we can see this fade that's happening. I think that's pretty. All right, so we know that the saturation that is here in the flower probably isn't very strong, so we can make some adjustments there so that we are not selecting that. Oh, you drug it the wrong way. There we go. So now I've really cleaned that up. I'm going to feather this edge out. Okay, and then I'll drag it and tighten it up. There we go. All right, so now we see that we've deselected all this flower from our selection, and we still have our nice fade on our background, okay? So now I'm going to turn off Show Mask. And now we're back to our image, and we have so we've done kind of complicated selection right here, okay? What we did was we made our first selection using our gradient tool, and then we cleaned that up with using our color constraints. Now, when I hover over the cursor, or when I hover over the thumbnail, we can still see those little tiny bit of residual bits of that flower being selected. So I can just simply use the brush tool and set it to eraser mode because I don't want to see those effects. And I can go in there and make sure that I don't have any effects just like that on the flower, right? So now I have, really I used all the types of masking that I could to make the mask for this layer. Okay. You the man, Darren. I'm glad that I answered your question, buddy. All right. So now that we've done all of this work inside of exposure, we have layers, we went over all of the different adjustments that we can make, we talked about them in detail. Well, what happens when we, I don't know, want to go backwards and see what we did? Well, in exposure, we have the history panel, and that saves every step that you've made through your process here in exposure. So if you started working, let's say, and you don't like the direction that it went in, you can just step back through your workflow here to where you didn't have that layer, let's say. So you can see where I added the layer. And I can step through each step in the process and go back and recreate or make adjustments if I want. Now, this history, this editing history, is recorded inside of the sidecar file. Now, if you remember earlier in the demonstration where I said that we're looking at images in the same folder, right, on our desktop, and then I brought over my handy dandy Finder window and said, hey, we're looking at this folder of images, and right here's where our sidecar files are. So if I was going to, let's say, collaborate with some other retoucher, or I edit on multiple computers, all I need to do is have this folder of images in a place where I can access it from multiple computers, or that it synchronizes to multiple computers, and both computers will have, it will synchronize exactly between both computers. So if you have a Dropbox folder, for example, or a G drive or something like that, you can just drag this entire folder into that G drive or Dropbox folder, and anybody with that with the Dropbox share will be updated with that as well. So that does include any of the edits you made and all the presets and all that stuff. So last thing, we are almost done. We have not talked about getting our images out of exposure, and that would be exporting. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let's export. I'm going to select all the images in exposure. That's Command A, and then go to export, which is Command E. Okay, so that's export, right? So what we do is, this is very similar to when we were copying images to the computer. If you'll remember that, is we tell it where we want it to go. We set the destination here on the top. We tell it what we want to name the files when we export it here. We can make up our own presets. That's what these gears are for. We can set file settings, information about the images we export, such as TIFF, PSD. We can just make a copy of the original in this space that we're telling it to be saved. We can add metadata, even watermarks if we have one saved. And you can set the image size of the images, right, that you're exporting, okay? I'm going to hit cancel. So if I did that, it would export all 4 of these images at with a file type that I specified in the area that I specified. But you can do it one step quicker, well, a lot of steps quicker, by using the quick export method. Quick export method enables us to, I'm going to deselect that, enables us, you can see right here, it looks like a grid work, okay? We have Facebook share, Twitter share, Instagram share. Essentially what these are recipes for exporting, okay? So we know that we want to save to the desktop. We know that we want to put it in an export folder, and we know that we want that export folder to have a folder in it that says Facebook. You see where I'm going with this? And you tell it how you want to name the file here. You set how big you want the file to be and what type. You set metadata information and what size you want the image to be. Now, I said this was a quick export method, so if I just click 1, it'll export. If I click 2, it'll export for Twitter. If I click 3, it'll export for Instagram. Or if I click multiple, I can export for all 4 of these places all at the same time with all 4 of the images I have selected. So it tells me I have 4 selected images right here on the bottom, and there will be 16 exported when I'm done. And then you click export, and it runs through those files and kicks them out. And we can see the export folders right here. And we can see there's a Facebook folder within it and a Twitter folder and the Instagram. There you go. You can see them. Wow, I haven't watched it do this before. Mesmerizing. Okay, so that, I believe, concludes our demonstration. So let's turn our attention over to answering any questions that we have. While I do that, let's say that if you want to get in contact with other exposure users, you can do so in our Facebook group, the Exposure Users group on Facebook. If you want to post your work and share it with us, we'd love to see it. Please post to Instagram and use our hashtag #MyExposureEdit. We do monitor that, so we would love to see what you come up with. And we want to thank everybody for your interest in exposure.